Buongiorno, Mirsa Erdet Inside Albania with me, Alice Taylor. With summer now feeling like a distant memory, things are starting to heat up when it comes to foreign policy and regional politics in Albania. In today's show, I'll be discussing regional cooperation, the place and purpose of the European Union, EU reform, the legalization of online gambling, and accusations against those involved in the Kosovo-Serbia dialogue process. I'll also be mentioning Prime Minister Edi Rama's head-to-head with Russia at the United Nations General Assembly. Albania has been making a name for itself over the past few years in terms of NATO membership, the opening of EU membership negotiations, chairmanship of the OSCE, various regional initiatives, and of course, its second presidency of the United Nations Security Council, which has just begun. With the Berlin summit less than 1 month away, regional politics making global headlines, and all eyes on the EU and enlargement, I wanted to find out more. I'm joined today in the studio by Dr. Odeta Barbalushi, an advisor to Prime Minister Edi Rama, the National Coordinator for Regional Cooperation, and an academic specializing in international relations and political science. Welcome to Inside Albania, Odeta.
Thank you, Alice. It's a pleasure.
In December last year, and I was present, and it was a fantastic event, Albania was proud to host the EU Western Balkan Summit, which was a first, non-EU member holding the summit. As I mentioned, it's less than a month until the Berlin summit. For those who maybe aren't so familiar with the Berlin summit, the Berlin process, can you give us just a short overview of what it is, what we can expect to happen, and any concrete results which will come out of the event?
Yes, Alice, thank you for mentioning the EU Western Balkan Summit last year. I was there, of course, I was in the room, and it was a moment of delight and pride, in fact, for Albania's role and its increased contribution, I think. Berlin process was launched in 2014 with the initiative of the then Chancellor Merkel, and it was relaunched last year in Berlin. And its relaunch, in fact, shows an enhanced attention to the Western Balkans, and also it underlines the EU perspective of the region. But this year's summit in Tirana, I think it's happening in a particularly important moment. I would say, without being over-optimistic, it's a new momentum in EU-Western Balkans relations. We have seen only a couple of months ago at Globsec, we have heard the statement of the President of the European Commission on a new growth plan for the Western Balkans with 4 pillars, which in a way have unfolded the vision of the Commission, of this Commission, for the Western Balkans, including deeper regional integration, deepening the domestic reforms, an enhanced political relation between the EU and the Western Balkans, and not less important, more financial instruments or increasing the pre-accession fund for the Western Balkans. And we are taking stock of these 4 pillars in preparing for the summit in October. And I think, and I'll try to be as objective as possible by taking over the chairmanship and the organization of Berlin process immediately following after the summit in Tirana last December, I think we are also showing ambition. Mm-hmm. And we are coming up with quite a few bold initiatives, particularly in the policy areas. In some policy areas which we have assessed, we have valued, are of strategic importance both for the EU and for the Western Balkans, and are indeed at the center of the policy agenda of Berlin process. Now, when it was launched in 2014, Berlin process had sort of 3 main pillars. The EU accession perspective of the Western Balkans, solving bilateral relations and trying or creating a more reconciliatory and conducive environment to solve bilateral issues in the Western Balkans, and thirdly, increasing or improving economic convergence, economic performance of our countries. And I think it's the 3rd pillar in which we are focusing for this year's summit. We are bringing a number of proposals which, in our view, would indeed increase economic convergence between the Western Balkans and the EU, and are very much in line with the vision of the President von der Leyen. In this respect, we are initiating a number of initiatives in the area of facilitating trade and transport, which is in fact at the core of the Berlin process policy agenda. We'll be launching the College of Europe in Tirana, and I think that's a very important moment, not just in the area of higher education. I think it goes much further than that. It is a step towards creating the new cadre of EU bureaucrats in the region, and I emphasize in the region, because that will be indeed an institution which will serve to students from the entire region, and I hope also students from other countries in the EU, so that we have a higher level of socialization in the area or of mobility among students in the region and the EU. We are also proposing a number of ideas which are related to certain policy areas. We'll also emphasize at the summit the importance of energy security and connectivity, and we aim to have a binding document among Western Balkan 6 and Germany, which is more of a bilateral nature, in the context of the climate partnership, which was launched last year in Berlin. And we'll also have a number of, let's say, smaller initiatives or more concrete initiatives, but in areas which we think will bring the region closer to the single market, or which will help us phase in some policy areas of the single market, let's say in the area of electronic payments or in the area of telecommunications, particularly a mechanism of Wi-Fi for the entire regions, or a number of ideas which would help us connect or be part of the value chains, particularly in the areas of raw materials and so on. From a political perspective, as I mentioned, this is happening in an important moment regarding relations between the Western Balkans and the EU. And given this particular context, we'll emphasize at the summit the importance of addressing interstate relations, of finishing all issues which are still not closed in the region, and calling to all other EU member states, the most invested, the most important, the biggest, but also the EU institutions, to help us in this.
Yes. This is an important issue, very much. It's very much, I think, the elephant in the room in this sort of event. Now, I wanted to ask as well, Charles Michel recently said that he hopes for the next batch of enlargement to sort of happen by 2030. And then France and Germany sort of came recently and said, but the EU needs reforming before enlargement can happen. And obviously reform, when we start talking about reform, we start looking at the opening of treaties, which is a big issue. EU member states are very divided on this, and it becomes very complicated. And this idea of Charles Michel starts to look sort of potentially further and further away, which is frustrating for the Western Balkans, who've been waiting for a very long time. Do you think the bloc needs reform before the Western Balkans can join? And I mean, what kind of reform does it need? And is it going to be possible to meet this sort of ambitious 2030 goal and carry out any necessary reforms?
Well, in fact, this is a debate which has started even before the accession of 2004, the big wave of enlargement with the countries of Central Eastern Europe, even before that. So it's a long debate whether we need a date or we need to carry on with the domestic reforms or internal reforms of EU institutions. And we in the region have only some ideas about it, cannot be direct contributors, so to speak. But I think there are a number of points that can be made in this connection. One is that when we are looking at a date, 2030, I think for us as a government it has been very important that we sit at the negotiating table and we start negotiating, because we see that as a process of Europeanization, as a process of securing and also lodging the reforms of our institutions in this bigger EU reform agenda, and securing the resilience of our new democratic institutions, including here institutions of the judiciary and so on. So in that sense, it's very much of a Europeanizing process, a reform process, and a process of socialization also with EU institutions. And not less, as the Prime Minister has often said, a process of knowledge transfer from the countries who know how this works to us. Now, the date is important in one respect from a policy perspective. It is important that we have some predictability, that this is not completely off the table. And 7 years, to be very honest, are not that far away. It's only 7 years. We are talking about the next, let's say, batch of pre-accession funds. We're talking about 7 years would be mostly sort of dedicated to, for us, domestic reforms, of what we also think of some phasing in some policy areas of the single market, and which is also envisaged in the new methodology. And this is, I think, the important question to ask, or the important discussion to have from this side, not from Brussels, but from the capitals of the region. What do we do in the meanwhile, from now to that 2030, to that sort of
That's where the
moving
Berlin process
deadline?
comes
Exactly. So first, we use Berlin process and regional initiatives as a vehicle to bring us closer to the single market. And in that respect, I also mentioned some of the policy areas which are important. Secondly, we, I think very much also in line with the new methodology, we are asking to be supported in our attempts to strengthen capacities. And thirdly, we need to do that with enhanced financial package from the EU. This is a request that we have been making. I think if you would hear leaders of the Western Balkans last year in Berlin, they sounded like they were reading from each other notes, asking for the same questions. We need increased financial instruments, more capacities, but also more harmonized policies with us when it comes to certain, let's say, policies which relate to certain challenges. And here higher education and demography and mobility is very important. Here the Prime Minister has highlighted this, I think, since when I go back, since Bordeaux Summit, I think in 2021, in fact, the need to phase in some policy areas, the need for increased pre-accession or pre-structural funds, and more alignment when it comes to certain policies with the EU.
One of the issues, potential issues for reform that's been brought up a few times, and we've seen in the region where countries have used their veto power to stand in the way of opening negotiations or to use it as a political tool in bilateral disputes. We've seen this used, and this has been brought up as something that could possibly be changed. Do you think this is something that should be addressed? Is it something that's potentially on Albania's agenda for discussing in the future, this veto power, you know, where one member state of the EU can put a stop to a country's accession process like that?
In fact, we have seen that it has been quite detrimental to the progress of our countries towards accession. And it is one of those issues that has at certain points also weakened the credibility of the EU, has weakened the credibility and integrity of EU accession process, because I think the core value of that process, it is merit-based. It is aimed at strengthening rule of law, strengthening the institutions of the countries, making the reforms resilient, and bringing these countries closer to the EU. And when one certain member state has blocked that, based on national interests or so on, I'm not going into that, that has really indeed weakened the predictability and integrity of the process. So this is something we have raised. Of course, it is for the Europeans to decide how they will go about it. But we have argued that enlargement policy is one of those policies where changes can be made so that it's impossible for one country to block decision-making of all countries. And we have seen that in the context of the Western Balkans. North Macedonia, perhaps, is the most extreme example of that.
Still going on now.
From the moment, yes, it was granted the candidate status to the moment of opening negotiations, it took up to 17 years. So this is an issue which I think is for Europeans to decide, to deliberate on, and to find solutions. I think the war in Ukraine has given a new impetus to the debate on EU accession, on EU enlargement policy. It has given also a new impetus to EU accession perspective of our countries. And I think this momentum should not be lost and cannot be blocked, by individual EU member states that put national interest above a bigger European vision.
I wanted to ask quickly as well, so this year, the Berlin Summit, as we've talked about, is going to really focus on regional cooperation, and how you've explained it, it sounds, that this is about the Western Balkans really putting in the practice, the preparation, to then gently move into the EU without it being such a shock in working in that way. And I really like this concept. But such regional cooperation, I am sure, is not without its challenges in the Balkans. We touched on that earlier. But what's coming up, aside from the Berlin summit, in terms of revitalising sort of regional cooperation? And what policies are there in the pipeline? How do these dovetail with the EU cooperation?
No, I think you touched upon something very, very important about what are the obstacles to regional cooperation? Because I've been coordinating this process since 2015 from my previous capacity, and I've worked on a number of regional initiatives. And I think one factor or one key obstacle that we have seen is political will from the capitals to integrate more regionally, to cooperate more regionally. Last year at the Berlin summit, we have signed 3 mobility agreements. One of these mobility agreements opens or paves the way for the moving of people from one country to the other in the region only with their ID cards. It's not been ratified yet by 2 countries, one for different reasons, one for political reasons, the other for procedural reasons, the way we see it. But it is important that all countries ratify this agreement. So far, it can be only applicable to those who have ratified it. So in that sense, I think the political will has really is the key factor to make it or break regional cooperation. And indeed, we have seen how since 2019, 2018 onwards, even the Berlin process sort of fell on the side. And to connect it or to respond to your question, how this is dovetailed with EU integration, this process was seen from the very start as a parallel process or a process which contribute to EU integration of our countries. So when also there was no more clarity or predictability with regard to EU integration after 2018, after Presma agreement was signed, and then nothing happened after that. After we were sort of given the green signal by the Commission that we are ready to open negotiations because all rule of law, criteria were met, and then nothing happened. So that sort of created a hiatus and created a vacuum. And then regional cooperation also fell aside because I think some capitals felt, why would we need to carry on with this? This is not relevant anymore, and So I think this is very important. It's a dual process, and I think where we are in the context of the current debate, but also in the current of the growth plan for the Western Balkans, which was launched by the President von der Leyen, I think it's very important to lodge our policy initiatives into this growth plan and use this growth plan for the Western Balkans as an instrument to phase in the region into the EU.
Now, we're talking about regional cooperation. We've talked about the EU and we've talked about the Berlin process. Now I have to ask about Open Balkan. Now, the Prime Minister recently said Open Balkan is finished, it's fulfilled its purpose, it's time to focus on the Berlin process. Now we have the summit coming up. And paraphrasing, but Vučić and Kovacevski were sort of like, what happened? Wait, I thought there was a bit of a divergence. They seemed almost a bit surprised. What happened with the Open Balkan? Is it that it's fulfilled its purpose? Is the Berlin process now been revitalized, it's taking its place? What can you tell us about it? Give us some clarification.
Well, for that, I think we need to go back exactly to the moment of 2018, 2019, where nothing much was happening, and both EU integration process and Berlin process had lost their strength and their rigor, and nothing was happening in practice. And we also felt that from businesses and from people working in trade, citizens, you still had a lot of concerns which were unmet. So a lot of needs which were unmet, and regional cooperation would be the only way to meet these needs. So Open Balkans was really born in that particular context as an instrument to give new boost to Berlin process and to regional cooperation. Let me remind you as a parenthesis that there are a plethora of different regional initiatives. We had even with the name of mini Schengen, we had some initiatives and ideas since as early as 1998. So if we look back, these are all attempts to revitalize regional cooperation, and in the context of the Open Balkans, to revitalize regional cooperation which works for citizens and for businesses. And I think we have indeed managed to, within that framework, we've managed to ripe some quite, I would say, very tangible results. Even if we think in that period 2020-2021, which was on the heels of the pandemic, we had an increase of exports, let's say even only from Serbia, over 45%, and from Macedonia, I think over almost 80% of exports, if we compare 2020 to 2021. So that really shows, I would say, the boost in practical terms that the initiative gave. Now, we have focused on Berlin process because that is indeed the main agenda of regional cooperation. It includes so many different aspects and policy areas which are of interest for both the region and the EU, including here, of course, trade, including transport connectivity, energy connectivity, railway and road, of course, I mentioned transport, but also the digital agenda. So there are a number, and I wouldn't go into details, a number of other elements of mobility, not less important, that in fact respond to or reflect what the main obstacles and what the main challenges of people and citizens in the region are. So for us, that is the main agenda. And the policy agenda of Open Balkans was part of that. So it, in a way, it implemented and it carried forth some very practical ideas, practical measures within that bigger policy agenda. Now we are focusing on Berlin Process Summit, and I think Open Balkans will continue in the sense that we'll continue to implement our commitments, for sure. And I would also add that in addition to its economic, practical dimension, that in certain moments, regional initiatives like Open Balkans can serve as the only platform where you can have some members, some participants with whom it's difficult to cooperate in other platforms. And here I have in mind particularly relations between us and Serbia. It was very important from a political perspective to have Serbia at the table on board in that particular moment in time.
Odeta, thank you very much. I'm looking forward to seeing what happens at the Berlin Summit, and I'd love to be a fly on the wall when you have the leaders of Kosovo, Serbia and Albania all around a table.
Thank you. I'd be very happy to come back to this studio after the summit.
It would be a pleasure. Thank you. In 2019, all forms of gambling were made illegal in Albania, except for a handful of land-based casinos. But recently, the government announced plans to legalise online betting and for all revenue generated by it to be funnelled into state programmes for sports. The law is in its last stages and is currently being debated in various parliamentary committees. But during the recent discussions, a number of concerns have been raised, mainly over supervision, problem gambling, and the risk of money laundering. I reached out to international iGaming legal expert Ron Mendelsohn to ask for his views on the proposed Albanian law and overcoming industry-wide challenges.